Before we get started, I'd like to get one thing straight. I think I was called capable or something like that this morning in the announcements. We all know it's really not me and anything that I can say. After years with the apostles, Jesus turned to Philip and said, "Philip, you still don't know me that well?" If Jesus couldn't get to all the things he wanted across to the apostles, I really can't do anything. And no matter what I say or how I say it, it's really up to you. Jesus kept saying over and over, "He that hath ears to hear, let him hear." I can't make you listen. I can't make you hear. No matter what I do or say, it may come off nice and polished or sounding good, but it's really up to you to take it and to put it as part of your life. Take the truth that we learned from the Bible. This morning we're going to be talking about the parable of the husbandman. We do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. This was in the bulletin. This is actually a picture of the bulletin from a couple weeks ago. And that's what I'd really like to talk about this morning. That we don't see things really as they are. We have our own viewpoints, our own preferences, whatever, but things are what we say they are. But we need to realize that it's true that we need to change this, the way we look at things. We must change the way we see things. We must change our way of thinking. And that's one reason we get together on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights and Wednesday nights. To have classes and sermons on how we need to change what we think and how we think. We need to look at it more as God does. And through Christ's Word, find out what's really true. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18, it says, we look not to the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Just because we see some things a certain way doesn't mean that's right. 1 Corinthians 3:19, for the wisdom of this world is folly with God. For it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile. We are so impacted by the wisdom of the world, what we live in, what we see every day and feel every day. We think that must be the truth. And yet, the wisdom of the Lord is what we need to learn. Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. This says that we have to be transformed. We have to renew our mind. We can't stay status quo and say, well, that's the way I see things, so it must be right. We've had three verses from the Bible that talks about this. Even in the world, we see that to be true. This last week was Thanksgiving. This is supposed to be a time when people stop and think the way they usually think and be more thankful. I always get a picture when I think of Thanksgiving of the pilgrims around the table with the Indians and the big turkey and venison and everything. Everybody's so nice and happy and so thankful. If I was there, would I have been thankful? The facts were that they were hungry and cold and dying. They were in a different country, far away from home and from friends. They were having a lot of troubles. Many of them had died, and now they were facing winter coming. How could they be thankful? Well, because you can also, in that situation, sit back and be thankful that you have friends. That you're building a new way of life in a new place where you have freedom. You're free to do the things that they wanted to do. There's two different ways to look at it, and we must choose to be more thankful. Coming up next month is Christmas, and one of the most famous stories is Scrooge. That definitely shows you there's different ways to look at things. He looked at one thing constantly, and to him, that's the way it was. You save money, you make more money, you try hard, you work at your job, that's what's important. But then he found out there's things that he didn't see then before. That people and friends and family, the things God gives us, is more important than the things that he thought was important. Right after that is New Year's resolutions. You're supposed to stop and say, oh, well, I've seen the gym as this bad thing that I have to go to, and now I'm going to make a resolution, and I'm going to there every day, and I'm going to lose weight, and it's going to be much better. Doesn't always work. But there is a different way to look at it. Even the songs that we have, one was from the 60s called Walk a Mile in My Shoes. The first verse in it's very interesting because it says, if you could see you through my eyes instead of your ego, I believe you'd be surprised to see that you've been blind. We look at ourselves through our ego, through our own eyes, and we can be blind. The Jews, especially the Jewish leaders in Jesus' day, needed to learn this. They needed to look at things differently. In Matthew 3:9, Jesus said, and do not think you can say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. I tell you, out of these stones, God can raise up children for Abraham. The way they looked at it, they were God's chosen people. They were picked. They were selected. They had it made. And Jesus said, you need to look at things differently. You need to look at the truth. Because God could make children of Abraham from these stones. Jesus tells them a parable that really illustrates this. And that's what we want to look at today. We want to look at the parable of the husbandmen. First, let's take a look at a little bit of a background of the parable. It's found in Matthew, also Mark, and Luke. 3 of the 4 gospel writers chose to put this parable in the gospel. What's the setting for it? The day before the parable, before this parable Jesus gives, Jesus has his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. That's when he comes in on the donkey and people are throwing their coats in front of him and the palm branches in front of him. Then he goes and he cleanses the temple. He drives out the money changers and the people that are selling in the temple. And that night he goes to Bethany to lodge. Bethany's a town very close by. Then the day of the parable, he makes an example for his apostles of the fig tree, which he had cursed and had died. Very quickly, and he talked about faith and how they should have faith. And then, as he was back in Jerusalem, he went to the temple, and the Jewish leaders challenged his authority. That's what led up, or what came about before the parable. The parable itself is very simple. There's a master that has a vineyard. He leases it out to husbandmen. And we need to probably talk about what husbandman is, because we don't talk about that today. Those are actually just tenants or farmers. One important thing to note there is that it's plural. He's not going to give it to just, he's not going to have a little vineyard that one person can take care of, like 5 acres, or, that's quite a bit, but he's going to have a large vineyard. And there's going to be many people working in it for him. They're going to be tenants or farmers. They're going to take the crops and give him back his share. However, in this parable, the husbandman refused to give him his share. They hurt and killed the servants and the son that are sent to collect it. This was read before. It talks about the man that owned the vineyard. When the season of fruits drew near, he sent his servants, and they beat his servants and killed one and stoned one. The owner sent more servants, and they did the same thing to them. And finally, he sent his son. And they killed him and so they could have the inheritance. Seems like a very simple parable. And I'd like to use this simple parable to look at it and see how you can see it different ways. The first way is the way we see it. As someone reading the parable centuries later, it's very clear, it's very plain. We see that the owner's God, the husbandmen are the Jews, the servants are the prophets, and the son is Jesus. So it seems very clear, very simple, very direct. God owns a vineyard. He lets the Jews rent it. All he asks back is what's due him, part of the crop. And they refuse to do that. And they hurt, kill prophets and the son. But there's a second way to look at it. And this is the way the Jews looked at it. The chief priests, the elders, the people. How did they see it? What's interesting is they did not see themselves as the husbandmen. They didn't see themselves as the tenants, the ones who were given these things. To finish the parable, after Jesus talked about them taking his son, the owner's son, and killing him, the next thing Jesus did was he asked them a question. And the reply to his question by the Jews show that they don't consider themselves to be the husbandmen. The question Jesus asked, after saying that his son had been killed, Jesus said, "When therefore the Lord of the vineyard shall come, what will he do?" And to those husbandmen, they say unto him, "He will miserably destroy those miserable men. And he will let out the vineyard unto other husbandmen, who shall render him their fruits in their seasons." I think it's very easy to see here, the Jews didn't know that Jesus was talking about them. He said the owner, what should the owner do to these people? He did all this work, he gave them the vineyard, and all he wanted was part of the fruits. What was due him? The tenants kill his servants and his son, and here Jesus asked, what should be done? What should the Lord of the vineyard do? The Jews are looking at it as, the Lord of the vineyard, the owner, is rich and powerful, and he's a favorite of God. That must be us. Well, you know what you should do to those tenants? You should kill every single one of them. Just wipe them out, destroy them, and give it to people who really deserve it. But they were talking about themselves. They didn't see that Jesus was saying, you are the tenants. They really didn't see things as they were. That's very interesting because it's similar to a lot of other things. In the Old Testament, we have the story of King David and Nathan. If you remember, Nathan came to David and told him a parable. The parable that Nathan said was a rich man had flocks and flocks. He had many, many sheep. More than he needed. And there was a poor man that had one little lamb. And he took the lamb and he fed it, and it lived in the house with him and his family. He fed it morsels from his table. It was the only lamb, the only sheep that he had. And the rich man had someone come to visit. So he says, oh, I need to feed this my visitor. So he went, and instead of taking any of his sheep, he went and took the poor man's sheep and killed it, and they ate it. If you remember what David broke in and said, that man deserves to die. He had all those things, and yet he went to the poor man's only sheep and took it and killed it. What did David not see? The parable was about him. He was the one that had done that. What's interesting here is David actually learned from that parable, and he did see. He did change the way he looked at things. That's not always true. In Esther, chapters 2 and 6, we see Haman and King Ahasuerus, or King Artaxerxes. In Esther 2, 21 and 23, 2 verses, Mordecai saves the king's life. If you go to Esther 2, you'll see that Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and 2 of the chamberlains of the king decided they were going to kill the king. Mordecai went to Esther, and Esther went to the king in Mordecai's name and said, these 2 people want to kill you. They're planning to kill you. The king checked it out. In verse 23, and when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found to be so, and both of the men were hanged on a tree. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So Mordecai had saved the king's life, and it was written down in the Chronicles in the book. And in chapter 6, it's interesting, the king can't sleep one night, so he has someone read from a book. And this is the part that was read. He said, well, was anything done for this man? And they said, no, absolutely nothing. At the same time, Haman was coming in to see the king. So in Esther chapter 6, verses 6 through 12, so Haman came in. And the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman said in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do more honor than to myself? And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let royal apparel be brought, which the king used to wear, and the horse that the king rideth on, and on the head of which a crown royal is set. And let the apparel and the horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man therewith, whom the king delighteth to honor, and cause him to ride on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Then the king said to Haman, make haste and do these things. He had to go and take the royal robe, the crown, put it on Mordecai, and lead Mordecai through the streets. And proclaim, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Then Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hastened to his house, mourning and having his head covered. He couldn't believe it. He thought he saw the way things were, that the king was going to honor him, and yet that's not the way it was. He had seen things wrong, and he had to honor his worst enemy. And now he was disgraced and mourning and had his head covered. In Isaiah chapter 5, this is very interesting in Isaiah 5 because you don't see too many parables in the Old Testament. In Isaiah chapter 5, there's a parable that I think Jesus is quoting in Matthew. It's almost identical. In Isaiah 5, verse 1, it says, my beloved had a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, and he digged it and gathered out stones and planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in the midst of it, and also hewed out a winepress. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. So here was an owner of a vineyard who did all this work, and he didn't get anything out of it that he wanted, that he needed. He didn't get a good fruit. In verse 4, what could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. I tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge, and it will be eaten up. I will break down the wall, and it shall be trodden upon. I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned nor hoed, and there shall come up briars and thorns. I also will command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of Jehovah is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for justice, but behold, oppression. He looked for righteousness, but behold, a cry. Here in Isaiah, there's a parable told to the Jews so they could understand that God loved them and he gave them all these things, and yet they didn't produce any fruit. And because of that, they were going to be punished. The Jews were like Haman. They didn't learn from them. They didn't look at any other way than the way they were normally looked. They refused to see what God wanted them to see. One last example in the Old Testament is from Genesis. This parable in Matthew is very similar to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, God, we know, had created everything and given it to man. He gave them everything they needed, and what did he ask in return? One simple thing. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He gave them all these things and asked them one thing, and what did they do? With the help of the serpent, they changed the way they looked at things and said, wait a minute. That's not the way I see things. I should be able to eat that. It's going to be good to eat. It's going to help make me wise. There's a lot of reasons, and they changed their viewpoint to the one that wasn't God's, and we know what happened then. Yes, the Jews saw themselves as the landowner, but they weren't the landowner. They were the husbandman. They had not given God what was due him. They had hurt and even killed the prophets and would soon kill his son. This is confirmed in the next verse after he asked the question. Jesus tells the Jews, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation producing the fruits of it. Who is that nation that God gave it to? It's us. God took away the vineyard from the Jews and gave it to the world. We have a chance of looking at this parable and making sure that we're not the husbandman. We're not doing the things that are wrong, like the Jews did in the Old Testament, and producing the wrong type of grapes, wild grapes that are sour and bitter and small. We need to be producing the fruits that God justly deserves. But there is one more way to look at the parable. The third way is God's point of view. What had God done in this parable? Well, he had the land, he had acquired, he purchased the land, he paid taxes on it, he cleared the land of stones and trees, etc. I don't know how many of you guys are following along with this, but if you were a farmer back in the early 1800s or maybe the colonists in the 1700s, you would understand this much better. You don't just say, oh, I plant a vineyard and it grows. You have to go out and dig the rocks up. You have to cut down trees. You have to dig up the roots from the trees. There's a lot of work. After you clear the land, now all you have is this hard patch of dirt out there that has most of the big rocks out of it and the trees taken out of it. You still have to cultivate it. You have to dig it up. You have to make it so that plants can grow in it. Then you have to go and plant the plants. I remember when I was a child, we went and planted potatoes, corn. I lived on a farm and my dad plowed the garden. It's not big enough just to till. In fact, we had 3 gardens, but he plowed them. And we would put a string down to plant, and it was like, it looked like 5 football fields long. It was about a foot, it was almost 100 yards, and you had to go and plant every single potato, or every corn seed, or every pea or bean. Here, the owner has to plant every single vine. He has to fertilize it. He has to build trellises for it, which are vine supports. He has to care for these plants. He doesn't just, oh, I just had a vineyard. He had to weed it as the vines are growing. And then it takes 5 to 6 years for the first real fruits so that you can make something from the vine. What else did God do in the parable? He put a hedge around it. I didn't have a picture of a hedge and a vineyard, so I put a vineyard there and then a hedge behind it. It's 2 pictures. But, because we don't have that often. But back then, you didn't just put a barbed wire fence or a fence around it. You had to plant. You had to dig and cultivate the ground. You have to plant the hedge. You have to prune and weed the hedge. And you have to wait for this hedge to grow up to keep people out, animals out. And it has to be so close together that small animals can't just get in and just destroy the crops. That people can't slip in and take the grapes. This is a very big project. And yet in the parable we read, oh, God had a vineyard. He put a hedge around it. What else did he do? He dug out a vat. Seems easy enough. Look at the vat. When you pressed grapes in the New Testament and Old Testament times, you dug out a solid rock. And then you had to dig all these little trenches and stuff so when you stepped on it, all the juice would run into place. You can't just put it on the ground and start stomping on grapes. He had to dig in solid rock to make the vat. What else did he do? God had built a parable. In this parable, he built a tower. It's so easy to read this parable, especially from where we are today, and go, oh, I see, here's a parable about those Jews. I'm so glad that the parable came true, and now God is taking it from the Jews and giving it to us. And we can look at the parable, and that's all it is. And that's the way we look at it. We can look at it as the Jews and say, look, I'm the rich. I'm the person who should own this and who should get my just deserts. But what I think we need to do is look at it from God's viewpoint. What has God done for us? Are we aware of what God's done for us? What has God done for you? For the church? Can we see things as they really are instead of seeing things the way we are? Romans 5:8 says, but God showed his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Do we see this? Are we really aware that when we were worthless, we were sinners, we were nothing, God still considered us worth so much that he sent his Son and that Christ would die for us? We need to change the way we see things. We need to be more thankful every day. We need to be less like Scrooge was at the beginning and more like he was at the end. We need to make resolutions and follow through with them. But what we really need to do is see how God's love for us should change our lives. No matter who we are or where we are, we need to understand that God loves me. That he sent his Son to die for me. That should change the way I live with other people, how I love other people, and how I worship God each day in my life. Do you need to change the way you live based on what you want or what you see? but on what really is, on God's holiness, on His righteousness, on His love. Do you need to repent, confess, be baptized to walk a new life? If you followed what seems to be, and now you want to follow what really is, please come as we stand and sing the invitation song.